Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by the Telos Group on the Telos channel. The Check-In is a semi-regular conversation amongst the Telos team and guest experts, where we explore the headlines from Israel-Palestine and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our communities, and our world. This is your host, David Cadabout, checking in from Washington, D.C. today. Today, we are diving into a topic we haven't spent much time on in this show, but that became an important story for us to discuss after the events of this past week, and that's Iran. How does Iran's presence, interests, and influence in the region shape political decisions by Israeli, Palestinian, and U.S. leaders? What difference does it make for Israelis and Palestinians on the ground? And how might we engage this historic moment in light of the events of this past week? Here to discuss that with us are two experts from the incredible organization DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now. DAWN is a nonprofit organization that supports democracy and human rights in the Middle East and North Africa. First, we have DAWN's executive director, Sarah Leah Whitson. Sarah has an impressive resume of accomplishments and awards and publications, but that includes serving as executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division from 2004 to 2020. We also have joining us Iran expert Omid Memarian, who serves as DAWN's director of communications. Omid is a journalist and human rights professional that previously worked with Human Rights Watch and most recently the Center for Human Rights in Iran. In 2005, he received a Human Rights Defender Award, the highest honor given by Human Rights Watch. We are very excited for this conversation. We're going to jump right in. Well, Omid and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. Omid, where are you checking in from?
Detroit, Michigan.
Sarah, where are you checking in from?
Brooklyn, New York.
Wonderful. And of course, we have Greg Khalil with us today. Greg, where are you checking in from?
I'm at Peak Eclipse, New York City.
Yes, we are recording this right now as the sun is going down during peak eclipse moments, but we feel this conversation is important to get to you as soon as possible. So we're going to dive right in, and I want to start with just some background information to the events that came out last week in the news. We all read and heard that Israel struck an Iranian consulate in Syria. Omid, can you give us an overview? What happened last week exactly?
The news was that Israelis attack a residence of the Iranian ambassador in Syria, and 7 Revolutionary Guards commanders were killed in that attack. One of them was one of the most senior Quds Force commanders. Somebody who was at the level of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, the commander that was killed by the U.S. In 2020. And Iranians claim that it was their official consulate and the residence of their ambassador. Israelis say it was not the residence; it was not an official diplomatic place, and they waited actually for the Iranian ambassador to leave the place to execute the operation. So the Iranian ambassador seems to be, he was at the meeting with all these generals. He left the place, and then Israelis attacked that location. The Iranians have become super agitated by the attack, and they believe that there should be a response, a very harsh response, because Israelis have been killing Iranian generals over the past few years throughout the region. And they think that they have lost their deterrence, and there should be a response. So Israel understands that they cannot go after their assets throughout the region. But there are other elements, there are other factors in play that we do not know yet, whether there would be such a retaliatory operation, or when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, who's going to be involved, whether the attack is going to be from Iran, from Yemen, from Syria, from Iraq, and whether the U.S. Assets would be targeted also. Nobody knows anything about the nature of this retaliatory action, but it seems that Tehran has decided to respond.
Sarah, I want to draw you in here. What are your expectations for how this might shift the current reality in Israel Palestine right now. Obviously, all of this is happening in the backdrop of the crisis in Gaza. Many tens of thousands of Palestinians dead, more than a million and a half displaced in southern Gaza and Rafah. Negotiations are ongoing, but it's unclear where they're leading. How might this affect what's happening right now in Gaza?
I think it's not yet clear how this is going to play out. I mean, it's important to see the attack on Iranian government officials, IRGC officials in Syria as part of an ongoing wave of attacks in Syria that Israel has been carrying out every month since October, on top of what has been, countless attacks since 2021 on various militias and armed groups that it deems to be affiliated with Iran, as well as very serious strikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah fighters since October that have killed over 100, allegedly killed over 100 Hezbollah fighters. I think from the beginning, it's felt like Israel wanting to take advantage of this chaos of the war to expand this into a war, not just against Hamas, but against Iran, because it believes that Iran is supporting Hamas and supporting other armed groups that are hostile to Israel. And, a very clear effort to broaden this war, to make it a regional war. And that is something that I think Hezbollah, Iran, others have tried to avoid. And I think that the question now is whether this is going to give Iran some kind of a leverage, as has been reported, although denied, to say, okay, we won't strike back at Israel if you secure an immediate ceasefire, President Biden. Now, that's been what's reported in the media. It's been extensively analyzed, but just very, very recently, the U.S. denied that any such offer was made. But it sort of escalates the role of Iran as a peacemaker, a mediator, an entity with a card to play. But it's also escalated Israel's hand to expand this war beyond Gaza against armed groups that are critical of Israel and, in their view, supported by Israel.
So walk us through exactly the intentions of Israel and why expanding this conflict, this escalation into a broader regional conflagration is in their interests. And then what does being a peacemaker do for Iran's leadership in the world? Why is that a potential role that they might want to play?
Well, if you're asking me, I would say, I can't really speak to Israeli motivations, or even if I can see an apparent motivation, I fail to see how it actually serves Israeli security interests. I think from the beginning of this war, given the immediate attacks in Lebanon that followed against some journalists in Lebanon, and then the expanded attacks on Hezbollah targets and the expanded attacks directly into Syria against Iranians and people deemed close to Iran. It's certainly seems like a very deliberate effort to expand this war and to engage the United States and potentially other countries to, taking on Iran and its so-called proxies once and for all. The reason I don't feel like this is an effective strategy, first of all, is because despite the great desire of many, including many in Washington, to believe that these armed groups are mere proxies of Iran, in fact, they're not. And they act independently with their own motivations, with their own interests, with their own goals. So you will find Western media repeatedly and routinely describing the Houthis as an Iranian-backed militia or an Iranian proxy. They are not. You will hear Hezbollah described as an Iranian proxy. They are not. You will hear Hamas described as an Iranian proxy. They are not. But because Iran is such a major military force, there have been continued efforts to drag them into a conflict, a broader conflict And I think with Israeli hopes that the U.S. will come along, potentially with some friendly Arab states to take on Iran once and for all. It's not happening, fortunately for all of us, fortunately for the people of Iran and the people in the region. It's not happening. And in fact, one might say Iran has shown a great deal of restraint. But, it's a very volatile region, and these things have a way of getting out of control.
Hearing a lot here that I think many of our listeners will react to. So first, I want to tease out that according to your analysis, regional war may be at least part of the motivation from Israel, maybe other players here. That's scary, right? That's something that we would want to avoid. And so I want to understand what that threat is, because that threat to me feels quite significant and less containable than the absolute historic atrocities already that we're witnessing today. And second, as I'm listening to this conversation, what strikes me is this sounds very different from every other conversation I've heard on this issue, and some of which I've participated in. So one of the framings that we hear is that like October 7th wasn't about Palestine. It wasn't about Israel. This was about Iran. And for those of us who've worked on the issue for many decades, we know always there's been this Iranian dark horse. And to be fair, Iran has, and particularly some of its current and recent leaders have backed terror in regionally and elsewhere. And so, hearing this talk about Iran as a peacemaker, I want to tease a lot of this out. So what is a proxy? Why is Hamas not a proxy? They've received money from, Iran historically and Hezbollah and all of these folks. And tell us a little bit more about that story, but bring it back to like what the real risk is of this moment, because we have a team on the ground, and our team on the ground there is saying, hey, everybody's talking about imminent war in the north, especially now that the troops have been removed from parts of the southern Gaza Strip, that like the northern border with Lebanon and Hezbollah, which we often hear referred to as an Iranian proxy, is really getting ready to heat up. So I want to get a sense, one, for that larger risk, really what's at stake, because this feels like a really consequential moment. And then two, let's dive deeper both into that Iran story beginning October 7th, but stretching back decades if we can.
First of all, we are in a regional war. And it is always shocking to me the extent to which Americans are not aware that the United States is fighting multiple fronts because of Israel's war in Gaza. The biggest war that the United States is now fighting is against Yemen and the Houthi armed group that governs much of Yemen. There is an active American war underway against Houthi targets, which the Biden administration has not sought congressional authorization or approval for. And a number of representatives have complained bitterly about that, given that, number one, many in the Biden administration formerly served in the Obama administration and bemoaned and decried and apologized for getting the U.S. in the war with Yemen, backing Saudi Arabia and UAE, and now doing it all over again. Interestingly, Saudi and the UAE are having no part of America's own war now against the Houthis, which is specifically focused on the Houthis' armed attacks on ships headed to or from Israel. At least ostensibly, that is their goal, and that's what they're doing. So the war has expanded in that you have two other parties to the conflict that are fighting thousands of miles away because of the war, the ongoing war in Gaza. There have been a number of attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, in Syria, and even in Jordan that I believe killed 3 or 4 American service members. That is directly in retaliation for America's continued military support to Israel in this war in Gaza. And the United States has carried out some retaliatory strikes, particularly in Syria, where it has its forces ready and able, not so much in Iraq or Jordan for political reasons of the governments not wanting to accept any expansion. But this has already expanded into regional fighting. And I think the only question is it going to expand? The second point I'll address before turning it over to Omid is the issue of what's a proxy and what's not a proxy. I think by any basic common understanding of proxy, a proxy is an agent. A proxy is someone who acts as your agent and takes instruction from you as to what to do. They represent your interests. They act as your representative as an agent. Hamas is not a proxy of Iran. It may receive financial support from Iran. I don't believe that it has actually received any military support from Iran because it's just physically impossible. The Houthis may have received some military assistance from Iran, but these are armed groups that exist with their own national causes, with their own interests, with their own agendas, and are not under the control of Iran. And if anything, I know that the Iranians don't want to see a conflagration in Yemen right now. They don't want to see the U.S. taking on this front because they were on the path to a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And a new expansion of the conflict in Yemen undermines their ability to have a rapprochement with the United States, even. But certainly it undermines their rapprochement with Saudi and the UAE. But they can't control what the Houthis do. The Houthis are not taking orders from them. So many analysts, including an article by Suzanne Maloney in Foreign Affairs this week, continue to just insist that these armed groups are proxies because they don't want to believe that there are groups of people with their own grievances in the region, whether against the United States, whether against Israel, whether against the governments whose sovereignty they live under, that have caused them to take up arms to resist. And they may do it using illegal means, and they may do it using legal means. But certainly Iran is not the only government, the only state providing weapons to armed groups or providing weapons that are used to commit terrorist acts. Sadly, that is very common and typical behavior in the Middle East. And sadly, I would say that the terror attacks carried out by Middle East governments far exceed the terrorist attacks carried out by armed groups in the region. If you look certainly just from a basic quantitative perspective of the number of civilians targeted and killed by states in the region versus the number of civilians targeted and killed by armed groups in the region.
Yeah, I agree with Sarah Lee that many of these groups have national grievances. They have interests to pursue, and those interests are probably separate from what Iranians might want nationally or regionally. But we can also say that without Iran's support, these groups would not be in the same place as they are now. Hezbollah is absolutely a strong group with 150,000 missiles, as they claim, because of Iran, and they don't shy. They're not shy about that, and they always basically thank Iranians and Iranian leaders for their massive support that they provide. The Houthis, they have their national interests, and again, the belief is even inside Iran, they always the way that Revolutionary Guards people speak about these people, this group and other groups, is basically that they act on behalf of the Iranian regime, and if they basically that they are a part of their national one of the tools that in their national security toolbox. So over the past few weeks, I've been listening to conservatives, people close to the Revolutionary Guards, in their rooms in Clubhouse, and you see again, they call them the axis of resistance. They bring Houthis and Hashd al-Shaabi and Hezbollah and other groups in the region as they call them as Iran's they call them proxies because they fund them, and yes, they do not operate 100% under the Iranian the Iranian regime's basically command, but Iran has a lot of influence over them. For example, after the 3 Americans were killed in one military camp in Jordan, Americans attacked a bunch of targets and sent a very strong signal to Iranians that if you go after Iranians, if these groups go after Americans, there would be a huge consequences for that. We see that over the past like a month or two, those attacks have stopped, basically have stopped. So that means Iran has a grave had huge influence over these groups.
I think there's a helpful conversation that I'm listening to here about like proxy, what's not a proxy. So I think often we use that term solely in relation to certain non-state actors in the Middle East. So like Hamas and Hezbollah, they're Iranian proxies. The Houthis in Yemen, they're Iranian proxies. What I hear you talking about is that there's a little interesting distinction that we should tease out, because I've used this terminology myself. So I'm learning a lot in this call. Israel, for example, is a huge benefactor of American political, military, financial support. And it's hugely influenced by the U.S., but it's not a proxy because it has its own independent agenda. It is a state actor, but the Palestinian Authority, so there's an interesting idea here that we only use this terminology in certain ways. But what I don't want to lose that necessarily, but what I do want to dig a little bit more deeply into is sort of the significance of this particular moment. And, one, I'm hearing that there is a reason, a longstanding reason why, from your analysis, Israel may in fact want to get Iran. Why? Like what, and it's less the other way around, whatever you think about Iran. So I want to understand what that interest is there, or for regional war, because I think that's one that many people have not heard or fully understand. And then second, we've got a call of mainly people from around the world, but mainly Americans listening at this moment. And something we've been saying consistently long before October 7th, but especially since October 7th, is that our listeners have outsized influence and have outsized power to shape American policy. So I want to get a sense of what America's actual role and potential role is in this particular dangerous moment. What should we be listening to? And is there something we should be saying?
Add just to what I said about proxies, that I think what we shouldn't do is to oversimplify the relationships in the region by using the word proxies, because the relationship between Tehran and Hezbollah is much different than the relationship between Tehran and Houthis. It's very different than between the relationship between Tehran and Hashd al-Shaabi and other groups in Syria and these relationships also changes over time and based on the other things that are happening in the region. So it's not like Iran has influence, might have 80% influence over, for example, Houthis now. 2 months from now, that influence might be 60% or 40%, because other elements, other factors impact the relationship and the influence the country has over these groups.
I just want to get a sense of the threat level right now, because this feels like a really consequential moment. And I think a lot of people listening and watching and reading may not understand just what's at stake at this moment. And second, the majority of the folks listening to this podcast are American. And what's America's role here? What should we be paying attention to? What should they be saying to actually, shift this moment in their communities, in their houses of worship, to their members of Congress, in the streets, wherever? So what's the significance of this moment? What should we be doing?
From my perspective and Dawn's perspective, there is a matter of utmost emergency right now, and that is the ongoing genocidal onslaught in Gaza. That has not slowed, that has not stopped. Israel continues to not only impede humanitarian aid, which Cindy McCain, who's the program director for the World Food Program, not a renowned liberal or leftist, was just today imploring Israelis to let aid in. There is imminent famine. And we have heard a lot of rhetoric from the Biden administration about tough words towards Israel, but that has not translated into action. So the first thing that the United States has to do, and what, we are now commemorating Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide, and American officials crying about failing to do anything to stop the genocide. In this case, we are complicit in the genocide. There's no avoiding the fact that but for U.S. military and political support for Israel, this war in Gaza, this slaughter of civilians, this slaughter of 13,000 children would not be happening. And while the United States does not control Israel, nor should it, the United States should end its own complicity, should end the supply of weapons to Israel at the very least until its irresponsible, reckless, inhumane behavior in Gaza stops. And that's an absolute emergency. And I think once there is a ceasefire, once the fighting stops, there will be an opportunity to think about how we can address this conflict, how we can address a conflict that's not going to go away, and neither Israelis nor Palestinians are ever going to be secure as long as Israel's military occupation, annexation, settlements of Palestinian land continues. And so if there is a silver lining to the horrors we've been seeing for the past 6 months, I hope it opens a pathway for us to reconsider ending the occupation, ending apartheid rule of Palestinians, and finding a democratic solution that respects the rights of the human beings living between the river and the sea to choose how they want to be governed, whether as one state or two states or three states. That will be the best thing that the United States can do for stability and security in the region. And I hope we can wake up from the fact that the past several decades of U.S. policies towards Israel and the Middle East has not made Israelis more secure, and certainly has not made Palestinians more secure. Overall, American officials, Republican and Democrat, keep promising us that they are going to, quote unquote, withdraw from the Middle East, reduce their military presence, their military footprint, reduce their security guarantees and military entanglements in the region. And yet administration after administration keeps getting sucked in. And so the United States has more military forces and more military bases in the Middle East than every other country in the world combined. This is not good for the United States. It's not good for our interests. We have an abnormal relationship with the Middle East that is driven by Israel, that is driven by the profit incentive of the defense industries that benefit mightily from the military presence in the region, from the continued ongoing conflicts in the region. And it's time for America to think about what's in America's interest, not in the interests of defense companies, not in the interests of Israel.
I'm going to jump in on that point, Sarah, because something that I hear often is that on the conditioning of aid to Israel, especially in this moment, is that offering of aid and military support is actually in America's self-interest because it counters Iran's influence in the region. And that part of it, building a national security apparatus for the U.S. means supplying Israel with weapons, with creating and strengthening a strong alliance. How would you respond to that comment, especially as we think about Iran in this conversation?
It's just so fallacious on so many levels. America's military and political protection and support for Israel far preceded the evolution of a conflict between the United States and Israel. And the tensions that the United States and Iran have are not necessarily linked to Israel or exclusively governed by Israel. I mean, from the Iranian perspective, the United States has been pumping weapons into the Gulf states at unprecedented levels, such that Saudi Arabia is now the largest weapons purchaser in the world and America's largest weapons client, the UAE close behind it, Bahrain, Qatar. All of these states are militarized to the teeth in this notion that Iran is a threat. And I think it's been used as a boogeyman to pump more weapons and dump more weapons into the region. I think that if Israel were to end its occupation and apartheid rule of Palestinians, it would diffuse the political exploitation of the Palestinian problem by the Iranian government, by other regimes who historically have used the Palestinian cause to try to build their own support. That's not really working anymore because even there are very few governments left that are still supporting Palestinians and are not in collusion with Israel, either publicly or privately. But the notion that the United States needs to be on a war footing with Iran to protect Israel. I don't see that being borne out. Israel's problem is its occupation and apartheid rule of Palestinians. If it would resolve that, if it would act like a normal government, a government that respects the human rights of its citizens, it will dramatically increase its acceptance in the region and in the world, and dramatically improve the safety and security of Israeli citizens.
I think what you're pointing out here, that the status quo of many, many decades of occupation is in no one's interest. But I think I'm very curious, particularly around the way in which the Iranian regime exploits the Palestinian issue for its own goals, and especially how that relates to public opinion on the ground within Iran on this issue. Omid, can you clue us in? Where does the Iranian public stand, and how does the government authorities potentially exploit those perspectives or those beliefs about the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
I think traditionally Iranians supported the Palestinian cause before the revolution and after the revolution, but over the past few years, we are seeing a very different sentiment inside the country. People are seeing that the Iranian government is using these causes throughout the region as one of the foreign policy doctrine, as a part of the foreign policy doctrine, and as a tool, and basically to survive, to stay in power, and they don't believe that the what the Iranian regime is doing is very authentic, and it's basically for the Palestinian people, or for the Lebanese people, or for the Yemeni for Yemenis. So we have seen a huge rift over the past years, in a way that people criticize the Iranian government's support of, for example, Hezbollah, criticize the support of Iranian government, if they their support of groups in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and that has been a huge challenge, because the Iranian government after the revolution always wanted to say, like, this is the Iranian people's will that we are supporting Hezbollah. This is the Iranian people's will that we are supporting these groups in Palestine. But now, over the past few years, they have lost that. And they cannot claim that. We have seen video clips from soccer matches in Iran, that the people people on the speaker ask people to react to something about the Revolutionary Guards or the people in Gaza, and then you see people in thousands basically reject what they are asked, and boo what they are asked. For example, if they say something about in support of people in Gaza, and the people boo them. That doesn't mean that people in general are against Palestinians, but it means that people are sick and tired of the Iranian government using these noble causes for their just to basically increase their leverages across the region.
Yeah, sadly, this is surprising to me to hear about Iran. I'm not as close of a follower of what's happening in Iran as I admittedly should be. Sadly, but it's not surprising, because I think it's the story of Palestinians is that this is a cause that resonates very deeply with people around the world who care fundamentally about human rights, and ever more so as the West is seen in some senses being the ultimate hypocrite, like proclaiming all these values that mean a lot: freedom, dignity, agency for everyone. And then here the Palestinian issue seems to run right up against that with us supporting policies and using our weapons, and that completely sort of contravene our rhetoric. Not that we don't in other ways, and so this is a common theme in the Middle East. I lived in Syria as a kid, and there's there was this idea of what the Syrian government wants. There's a lot of rhetoric about the Palestinian cause. This is the emblematic of the big bad guy in the West, right? But there's no action there, and so I hear that, and that sounds sadly familiar. I think what feels different for me in this moment is kind of being in America right now, and just seeing how many people feel unmoored and directionless and sort of very disillusioned with our own government, our own institutions. It feels like all of our institutions, in a way, are failing us. Like, I also teach at a university, and we've never had a serious conversation around these issues because they're so hyper politicized. And like, what is a university's purpose if it can't equip people to actually have meaningful conversations about the issues that are most concerning to our collective well-being and to justice and to human rights in the world? So like, there's been this complete abdication. So I guess where I'm processing this is, and landing, and want to land with both of you here, is I hear you, Sarah, coming back to a very fundamental point, which is like, yeah, there's a lot to discuss here, a lot of uncertainties, and a lot to be scared about. But the thing that we really have to do right now is pull every possible lever for ceasefire. Like, nothing else, even if this is being used as distraction, there is something happening in real time with our government support, political, it's money, it's weapons. And so whatever those ways are to speak up, if we're worried about escalation regionally, which we should be, because this is a horrific problem, which sadly, like, once this spreads to Jerusalem, the West Bank, can become even more unimaginably horrific. And once it spreads out regionally, right? These are all things we should all want to contain, even if we don't know what the next steps are. It's got to stop the hemorrhaging right now. So this call for ceasefire. Now that that's front and center again, which I think it needs to be until we get ceasefire, which is the first step, not the last step, just the very next step. What should people be paying attention to? Is Iran just a distraction? What is the regional concern? What do you want our folks, when they're back in their communities and they hear this isn't really about Israelis and Palestinians at all, this is just about Iran. There's a big war that's Armageddon's going to happen, whatever it is, and Iran's this big actor out there. What should our folks say? How should we think through this? We know we've got to focus on ceasefire, but coming back to Iran, like, what's the major, like, the simple sort of story about Iran?
Basically, it's not and shouldn't be up to the United States to determine and decide what happens in the Middle East and what happens in the region. We are not the policeman of the world. We're not the policeman of Iran. We're not the policeman of Saudi Arabia or Israel and so forth. We have to normalize America's behavior in the region. And that means ending our support for dictatorships and apartheid governments in the region, ending the unbelievable dumping of arms and the arms race that we have single-handedly created in the region, normalizing our relationship with every government in the region such that, like other governments, it is one that is predicated on trade, technology, education, exchange, mutual interests, but not a militarized approach. And even the sort of the way of approaching the problem, what are we going to do about the problem? If Iran is a problem, it's a problem of the international community. It's a problem of the United Nations. And sadly, the United States does not have the credibility to lead on solving the problem of Iran. It just doesn't. But I also wanted to just briefly address the issue in terms of what's at stake for the United States in its continued support for Israel in this war, with military support and political support. And I see the risks to the United States as very, very costly. And I think people should pause to reconsider whether it's worth it. Put aside the moral questions. Even if you don't care about Palestinians, the reality is that we have already expanded our military profile, the kinetic activity that's underway thousands of miles away in Yemen because of this war. American service members have been killed in Jordan, in Syria, because of America's support for this war. We are now in a position of attacking and undermining two of the pillars of the international legal order, what President Biden and other Western democracies have told us are existential for the survival of the international world order and the survival of democracies. And that is the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Because these two courts are investigating Israeli atrocities and crimes, the United States is undermining and attacking and sabotaging these courts. This means that the United States is damaging the very international bodies that we need for the international rules-based order to survive. And it's undermining America's ability to project itself as doing the right thing in a place like Ukraine, where how can people in the world believe that the United States is fighting against occupation, invasion, illegal Russian attacks against Ukrainians when it's supporting those very same attacks and much worse by Israel in Gaza, if you look just numerically at the number of civilians killed over the period of time? It means that the United States is not believed, it's not trusted. It cannot take a position of leadership to figure out what we should do vis-a-vis Iran or anywhere else in the world, because its credibility is undermined as standing for the international rules-based order and international law. As long as our government continues to make exceptions for Israel, that pillar of credibility on which our country has depended for a long time is very, very significantly corroded.
I would end with this, that fortunately Iran is not in a position to start a war or be interested in engaging in a regional war. The US in the past few months has tried so much to all the engagement in Yemen and other places, but they have been trying not to expand the war from Israel, and that's why, for example, after the consulate attack, Americans told Iranians directly that we had no involvement in the attack and we had no information about the attack. The reason is that they wanted Iranians to know that this happened without the Americans' knowledge and that it doesn't turn to a bigger conflict. And there are other groups in the region that I think there is very little appetite for making this conflict in Gaza a bigger conflict. And I hope that we see a more effective diplomacy and more effective process in the next few days and next few weeks, and somehow all these powers, Iran and others, US, Israel, they avoid getting into a bigger conflict, because it's it could be a very dangerous path for everybody in the region and the US.
Folks, we are in a historic and urgent moment. We need to pay attention. We need to engage our communities and our networks, the leaders in our communities, our faith leaders, our families, our friends, our elected officials, because this involves us as we are learning. Not only are we participating in what's going on, participating in the destruction of Gaza and the displacement of millions of people and the killing of tens of thousands of civilians, but we're also, as Sarah is saying, inflicting a self-inflicted wound in the process on our own nation and our own standing in the world, and the survival of the rules-based order, which protects all of us, right? So we must speak up, stand up, pay attention, and keep leaning in. This is so urgent. Thank you so much, Omid and Sarah. You've been so insightful and helpful. We're really grateful for your time today. Sarah Leah Whitson is the Executive Director of Dawn. Omid Memarian is the Director of Communications at Dawn. You can learn more about their work at dawnmena.org, and you definitely should. It's very important work that they are doing. Thanks for listening, folks, and we will see you next time.